This video shows an example of a poorly done interview and contrasts it with a much better one. To give the context for this, I'm first going to summarise the 10 characteristics of a good interviewer that Steinar Kvale gives in his 1996 book Interviews. Kvale starts with the interviewer needs to be knowledgeable and familiar with the topic of the interview and will have piloted to give themselves practice and experience of doing the interview. The interviewer gives structure. The interviewer starts with an explanation of the purpose of the interview and rounds off at the end. For example, by asking if the interviewee has any questions or has anything to add. The interviewer is clear. The questions that they ask are simple, easy and short. They don't use jargon. The interviewer is gentle. They let people finish what they're saying. They give the interviewee time to finish. They tolerate pauses. They give people time to think and don't interrupt them too quickly. The interviewer is sensitive. The interviewer listens attentively to what is said, and the interviewer empathises in dealing with the interviewee. The interviewer is open. The interviewer responds to what is important for the interviewee. The interviewer is flexible in the way that the questions are asked, and responds to the issues raised by the interviewee. However, the interviewer also needs to be steering. The interviewer needs to know what he or she wants to find out. They use questions and prompts and probes to get the information they're interested in for their research. The interviewer is critical, not so much disagreeing or even agreeing with the interviewee, but rather the interviewer is prepared to challenge what is said to them. For example, inconsistencies or ambiguities in what the interviewee says. The interviewer remembers. Especially, the interviewer should remember what has already been said earlier on in the interview. They can relate back what is discussed now to what has been previously said, and they avoid asking things of the interviewee that the interviewee has already talked about. The interviewer interprets. The interviewer can clarify and extend the meaning of what the interviewee says. Sometimes they may do this by summarising for the interviewee what they have just said. To Kvale's list, Bryman adds 2 more criteria. The interviewer should be balanced. They shouldn't talk too much, which might make the interviewee passive, and do not talk too little, which may result in the interviewee feeling that he or she is not talking along the right lines. The interviewer is ethically sensitive. That is, the interviewer is sensitive to the ethical dimension of interviewing, ensuring the interviewee appreciates what the research is about, its purposes, and that his or her answers will be treated confidentially. What follows is a short video of an interview that falls down on many of these criteria. See how many you can spot. First you'll see the video without interruption, and then you'll see it again with some comments from me where I think it is falling down on some of the criteria.
Hello, Amanda.
Hi.
Come in. Come in. Sit down. Thanks for coming to talk to me today. How long have you been driving, Amanda?
13 years.
Right. And what's driving like for you?
Usually I enjoy it, but sometimes it's stressful.
Right. Okay. And what was it like learning to drive, and how long did it take you?
Learning to drive was nerve-wracking.
And was it stressful then, taking your test?
Yeah, it was stressful. I was really nervous.
Right. Okay. Thanks for talking to me today, Amanda.
Now let's see that again.
Hello, Amanda.
Hi.
Come in. Come in. Sit down. Thanks for coming to talk to me today. How long have you been driving, Amanda?
Well, that was a very brief introduction. The interviewer didn't explain the context of the interview, who she was or what the research was about, and there was no consideration of any ethical issues at all.
How long have you been driving, Amanda?
13 years.
Right. And what's driving like for you?
Notice the lack of eye contact here? The interviewer seems to be simply reading the questions. She's not making any attempt to build any kind of rapport with the interviewee.
And what's driving like for you?
Usually I enjoy it, but sometimes it's stressful.
Right. Okay.
Notice that the interviewer just simply accepts the short answers to her questions and makes no attempts to give any prompts or any follow-up questions. For example, she could ask the interviewee why driving is enjoyable, or even better, ask her to give an example of when it's enjoyable.
And what was it like learning to drive, and how long did it take you?
Change of topic, but a much better question. What was it like? However, it's then spoiled by the second question, how long did it take?
Learning to drive was nerve-wracking.
And was it stressful then, taking your test?
Notice the long pause here. The interviewee is clearly thinking about the stress of learning to drive, but the interviewer offers no probe at this point, no further investigation. And in fact, next the question changes the topic again to the test itself.
Was it stressful then, taking your test?
Yeah, it was stressful. I was really nervous.
Right.
The question about stress invites a yes or no answer, and that's exactly what the interviewer gets. It needs a follow-up question about, for example, why was it stressful? But this is not forthcoming.
Okay. Thanks for talking to me today, Amanda.
And so the interview ends rather suddenly, without the interviewer having found out very much at all about what Amanda, the interviewee, thinks about driving or learning to drive. Notice that the interviewee, Amanda, seems rather ill at ease and is not very forthcoming with information. The interview also ends very suddenly. There's no chance for the interviewee to add anything else which she might have thought of. Now let's look at the second version of the interview, where the interviewer makes a much better job of addressing some of the problems I've outlined in the case of the first interview. Notice also how she makes a much better job of establishing a rapport with the interviewee, and consequently gets much more information about what she thinks about driving and learning to drive.
Hello, Amanda.
Hi.
Come in. Hi. Sit down. Make yourself comfortable. Thanks for coming along today to talk to me. I hope that this sort of experience of us going to this interview this afternoon will be pleasant and interesting for both of us. As you know, the aim of the research really is to find out a little bit more about what people's experience of driving is like, particularly learning to drive and events around learning to drive, like taking your test, for example. And as I explained before in the participant information sheet, the reason that I've asked you is because I'm aware that you're a driver, and I wanted to find out a little bit more about what your own personal experience of learning to drive has been about. Now, I'm not expecting the interview to last very long, probably only about 10 minutes or so. And I just need to check out a few things with you before you get started.
Mm-hmm.
I know that when we spoke earlier, you agreed to take part in the interview, but I just want to check that that's still okay with you.
Yes, it's fine.
Great, that's brilliant. Now, it's important to let you know that if you want to stop at any time or you want to take a break, you can. And if I was to ask you a question that you didn't want to answer, please feel free to just say, I'm sorry, I don't want to talk about that. That's absolutely fine.
Okay.
And as we agreed earlier, the whole purpose of using this interview will be for the research, but also to use the interview for teaching purposes. Can I just check that's okay?
Fine.
Lovely, thanks. Do you have any questions for me before we get started?
No, I think I'm happy, yeah.
Okay, right, that's lovely then. Okay. Can you tell me how long you've been driving?
I've been driving for 13 years.
Right, gosh, 13 years, okay. And can you tell me something about the feelings that you associate with driving?
I think mainly when I'm driving, I really enjoy the freedom that I can just go where I want, when I want. And although it can be stressful when you get stuck in traffic, but when you go on public transport, you're very much waiting around and it can not turn up, and that's really frustrating.
Right.
So I really like the freedom that it gives me.
Yeah. You mentioned there about stress and it feeling stressful. Can you perhaps give me a bit of an example or tell me about a time when...
Just like when you can get stuck behind someone who's really slow, or there's a really bad traffic and there's nothing you can do, you're just stuck there and it can make you late, but you can't do anything, you just have to wait till the traffic moves on. That can be annoying.
Right, okay, that's great, thanks. One of the things that I'm particularly interested in finding out about are people's memories of their experiences. And in particular, the sort of stories that people tell of events that might happen to them or their experiences of certain times in their lives. And I particularly want to ask you about that in relation to your driving behaviour. What I'd like to ask you to do is to think back to a specific point in time when you were learning to drive.
Right.
Maybe a specific experience or maybe a particular lesson, and tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I can remember when I was learning to drive, in my car, but my mum had lent it to a friend because obviously I couldn't drive it on the road at the time. And so the deal was that they took me out for practice every week and they got to borrow the car.
Right.
Of course it caused a bit of a clash of interest because it wasn't in their interest for me to pass my test, because then they'd have to give the car back.
Right.
So when I was learning to drive, it made it a bit uncomfortable because I was kind of aware of that, and I felt sometimes he was a bit undermining of my driving rather than encouraging me, because he had his own, like I'm saying, he probably didn't want to have to give the car back. And I can also remember, he was really nervous eating sweets because I'd go too fast. I can remember approaching a dual carriageway too quickly and literally screeching like in a movie round, just barely having control of the car. So I think he tolerated quite a few incidences, near misses and stuff.
Right, near misses, that's interesting. Tell me about it. What about a near miss?
Well, just, driving a bit too fast and having to brake heavily and just inexperience really. Right. And learning to have control of the car.
Okay. So that's two quite separate feelings. Remember when I asked you in the question before, you were talking about a feeling of freedom that driving gives you now. Yeah. How does that compare to that feeling and that feeling of that you're on about there about near misses?
I think I was desperate to pass my test because I lived in a small village, right, miles away from the nearest town. So it was really important for me to be able to drive to get to college. So I think there was sort of a real anxiousness to pass, and yet, learning to control a car can be really, difficult, sort of understanding how gears and stuff work and how, learning what the speeds you should approach corners and whatever. So I think, I was looking forward to passing my test so I'd have that freedom.
Great, that's great, thanks. Okay, what I'd like to do now is get you to think back to the driving test itself.
Yeah.
Take some time to think about how you felt at the time of your test, and maybe about some of the events that happened in your test, and tell me the story of the test, perhaps by starting at the beginning and working your way through to the end.
Right. Well, I can remember on my test, just as we got out of the test centre, I stalled. I think everybody does that, so I was really nervous. So I think they kind of overlooked that. And then I can remember, I was doing my best because, as I said, I was really keen to pass and get on with driving. And I can remember thinking it was my first test, and most people don't pass their first test. So that made, I think in a way that makes you think, well, maybe I won't pass, I'll just do my best. And I can remember approaching a roundabout, and there was a cyclist in the middle of the roundabout, and I was being really careful not to knock over cyclists, really checking and everything. And I forgot to signal when I left the roundabout, and I thought, oh, he's going to mark me down that. But I actually think, when I look back on it, I think he was really impressed that I was really concerned about being careful around the cyclist and making sure I didn't cut them up and stuff. And so I think that was although I forgot to do that, I think he was impressed by how I handled the situation. And I was glad that I didn't have to do parallel parking, because I found that really difficult. I think I did a 3-point turn, so that was a relief, because I really struggled on that. So, apart from stall at the beginning and stuff, I think it went okay, and I was really pleased that I passed.
Right, oh great, it's passed first time.
Yeah.
Oh, smashing. That's wonderful. Okay, so you mentioned, that time when you were going around the roundabout and you were trying to avoid the cyclist. What kind of feelings were going on for you then?
I think I was more concerned about not hitting the cyclist rather than thinking about signalling, which was, when you think of what a testing that you have to do, looking in your mirrors and signalling, manoeuvring everything. And but I think he was impressed that I was more concerned about the cyclist rather than, the manoeuvres when I could have done something wrong and had an accident. So I think that was in my favour.
Yeah. How did it feel when you found out you'd passed then?
I was exhilarated. I was so happy. I went straight home and went round to the friend's house to tell you about it and passed the test. Can I have the car, please? And I was sort of like, great, well done, but yeah, it was great. And I went off for a drive, and I really felt free at last that I could go off and do things. So yeah, for a week I was like, anyone want a lift? Get something from the shop. So yeah,
that's great. Thanks ever so much for sharing that with me and talking to me about your experience. That's really all the questions that I have for you. Do you have any questions that you want to ask me?
No, I think I'm happy with that.
Okay, that's lovely. Thanks very much.